and welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WBEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how things in Montpelier shake out for the rest of us. And actually this week, we will talk a little bit how things at the federal level may shake out for the rest of us. Welcome to the show, regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, who's one of three representatives for the town of Brattleboro. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Olga. Good to see you today.
Good to see you too. And Chris Campany from the Windham Regional Commission. I'm so glad you can join us today.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So we want to dig into ARPA money and what it means for local communities and how local communities can use it, what they need to be thinking about. We've all heard that this kind of chunk of change could really be revolutionary for a number of issues and projects and communities, but what will that actually look like? What does that mean and how do we get there? So I don't know, Emily or Chris, who wants to take this first question? Well, but I'd love to get just a lay of the land right now with ARPA, like where are we? Has the money started to arrive? Like just kind of a lay of the land for folks.
Before we even get to that, I would just like to sort of set up how unusual this is. And then maybe Chris can sort of tell us a little bit more about some mechanics, but the federal government very, very rarely gives money directly to communities. And state government actually rarely gives money directly to communities. The bulk of our town funds are raised through local taxes and stay mostly local, and there's some mechanisms that we're not going to get into here, but it's really quite unusual to have money go directly from the feds to the towns without the state sort of interfering and designing how that money might be spent. And so having this really flexible pot of money at one time I don't think that's happened at any point that I'm aware of in Vermont history even. And so occasionally some of our larger city, Burlington sometimes gets direct federal money because they're a city and they're under sort of different rules. But especially for our smaller towns, they don't even have systems in place to figure out how to spend such money. And so this is like really exciting. And I'm really excited about how the Regional Commission is stepping up to help people navigate this wild time.
Do you want me to pick up, Olga?
Yes, please.
Yeah, and Emily's exactly right. It is very unusual in that there are no other external directives other than the guidance from the U.S. Treasury, and that's one of the reasons why the state asked the Vermont League of Cities and Towns to partner with the state's regional planning commissions to help the towns understand what the rules are to use the funding, and VLCT is really taking on the role of explaining the rules and regulations around it, the details, and ultimately what they're going to have to do to report and all of that. But the funding has already gone to towns, and I will share with your audience. I will tell you what I know and what I remember well, and what I don't. They can always ask, and I'll put in. If I put something in chat, will people be able to see it?
They won't, but we can add it to show notes later.
Yeah.
Okay. So the main thing I'll just tell everybody right up front is if you want a lot of details about how the program operates, go to the Vermont League of Cities and Towns and just click on their ARPA resource. You can even search Google. If you search VLCT ARPA, you'll come up with to their resource page. It's a really good page, a lot of information. And I guess we said ARPA is American Rescue Plan Act. The funding went directly to towns within the Windham region, and for us that's all of the 23 towns in Windham County and Searsburg, Winhall, and Reedsboro and Bennington County and Weston and Windsor County. For all of our 27 towns, it comes to a total of about $13 million that's going to towns. And
Sorry, I just want to let our listeners know that and let you know, Chris, actually, that Katie Buckley from the Vermont League of Cities and Towns is going to join us next Friday
Great.
to sort of talk more about what this means on a statewide level. And we're really excited to hear from you about how you're sort of navigating things in Windham County.
Great. The funding, there are two, basically it goes to towns by formula. That's based on primarily on per capita. And the towns are getting both their share per statute, per federal statute. And then they're also, because Vermont does not have county government, they're also getting what in other states would have gone to county government. The towns are also getting the county share distributed. And so that's one of the reasons why they're getting, for our towns with relatively small population, are getting a rather large chunk of change for this. So the money is being delivered in two different tranches. I'll let Katie get into the details of that, but there's a tranche that's coming this year. There's a tranche that's coming next year, and there may even be some in the middle. But the good thing is, unlike the CARES Act and other pandemic funding, towns have time to think this through and spend it wisely, and that's critical. Unlike the CARES Act, where everybody's rushing to spend money within weeks or a couple of months, and having to stand up an administrative structure with zero time. This funding, everybody involved is encouraging towns to take their time, think this through, because they have until December 31st, 2024 to spend it or obligate it. So your projects don't even have to be done by the end of 2024. You just have to have the funding obligated. So that's critical, because if we're talking, especially infrastructure projects or something like that, that takes time to prepare and stand those up. And plus, one of the things that we're encouraging towns to do, and this is one of the reasons why they need to take their time, is to think about how do you pair up the town money with other potential state and federal resources to really maximize the resources that they have at their disposal.
And I imagine that the promise of the infrastructure funding that might or might not ever make it through Congress would be a very sort of available pairing to this. If and when that happened, that would also be significant resources for towns.
Potentially, yeah. But the other piece of this too is that there are interim Treasury guidance that's gone out and they solicited comments on it. And when I say Treasury, this is U.S. Treasury. But also, the final Treasury guidance has not been released yet. And so, frankly, we are not advising towns on anything specific yet until we see what the final guidance says. Because right now, we don't know exactly, it's my hope that they're going to allow towns to also invest in planning to do the infrastructure work, or that could be part of the project. Because a lot of towns don't have to do the kinds of things that they might want to do, haven't done the planning and scoping and design and other work that you have to do. And hopefully it's not going to be one of these programs where, and I don't think it will be, but I'm just saying, too often these programs are like, the project has to be shovel ready. Well, there's a lot of work that has to go into something before it's shovel ready.
Yes.
Including all the permitting and everything else. So, and so I hope I'm not boring people with all this, but this is why it's important for towns to just kind of take a measured approach. And the other thing that we're waiting for is still guidance from the state about what funding that's going to be available now. And the legislature is going to be back in session to also determine how to use additional funds. And so there's already funding that came through ARPA and just other sources that, even independent of any other infrastructure bill that may come through the feds, that there's already other sources of funding out there that the towns may be able to pair their money with. And if you want, I'll go through what they can spend the money on.
So few quick things. One, we really aim to bore our audience here on the Montpelier Happy Hour. So feel free to go as deep into the details as you want to. That's, I think, who tunes in. It's an hour-long show. There's very few sound bites available in it. So feel free to go into the weeds. The other thing, just want to sort of lay out for folks is that, as Chris was saying, the state of Vermont, the legislature have only allocated about half of our ARPA dollars. And we're planning on tackling strategies for the next half of our ARPA dollars in this upcoming session. And Carolyn Wesley, who's the Senate Pro Tem's chief of staff, is coming in next week to join Katie Buckley to talk about a listening tour that they've done around ARPA, so to give some feedback on what we might be thinking about spending for in this upcoming year. Back to you, Chris.
Great. Sure. So these are pretty broad categories, and just bear with me, I'm going to read them verbatim so folk know. So there are four broad criteria outlining eligible uses. And again, you can find this on the Vermont League of Cities and Towns page, or I'm sure just search ARPA and eligible uses. And this is straight from the U.S. Treasury. The first is to respond to public health emergencies, to the public health emergency or its negative impacts, economic impacts, including assistance to households, small businesses, and nonprofits, or aid to impacted industries such as tourism, travel, and hospitality. The next is to respond to workers performing essential work during the COVID-19 public health emergency by providing premium pay to eligible workers. The third is for provision of government services to the extent of the reduction in revenue due to the COVID-19 public health emergency relative to revenues collected in the most recent full fiscal year prior to the emergency. In other words, you can help fill a hole that was created during the pandemic. You cannot use it to reduce this year's taxes. Mm-hmm. And then last but not least importantly, to make necessary investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. And what's not noted there is in the Treasury guidance, they've also said they can also relate to clean water. But there was talking about clean water in relationship to water infrastructure. In other words, like drinking water infrastructure. So we're not really sure yet how broad that clean water provision. We're not really sure what that looks like just yet. Is that going to be like you can buy land for wellhead protection if you have a municipal well or something like that? Or is it going to be broader? And so we'll have to see. And so I'll just go briefly through each of those just for some detail. So in the first one, the response to the public health emergency and its negative economic impacts, including assistance to households, small businesses, nonprofits, or to aid impacted industries such as tourism, travel, and hospitality. We're fortunate to have a number of groups in the region and statewide that provide services, to individuals and households and the general public. And there are other groups that assist with tourism, travel, hospitality. Some of those groups, I remember early on, I'm not as up to speed with what's happened lately, but some of them will be making pitches to towns to ask for, would you be willing to contribute some of your ARPA funding to that effort? And that is something that towns can do. They can provide funding to other groups that are doing things in their community as to meet needs as long as it meets those ARPA guidelines. And of course, the towns are going to have to report in excruciating detail on how they spend all their money. But as long as they feel comfortable that, and hopefully these groups will have done their homework and know that what the work they're doing qualifies. So towns will likely be hearing from different groups that provide that work. On the response to workers performing essential work during the COVID-19 public health emergency, that's really talking about public health workers and folk like that. We've had some questions from towns like, can we increase our pay like to road crews? Because for most of our towns, for a lot of our towns, that's the only, that they have very limited number of employees, and so road crew, so that's a logical question. But they really wouldn't qualify. It's really people who are frontline workers addressing the pandemic. And then for the provision of government services to the extent of the reduction of revenue, that all that jargon basically means if there's a hole in the town revenue that can be directly attributable to the pandemic, then you can use ARPA funding to fill that hole.
So one example of that I've heard about, which feels like very straightforward to use as an example, is the town parking fund in Brattleboro is much lower than it would be in a normal year because people were parking a lot less during the pandemic. And so that parking fund pays for a bunch of regular costs that were still needed to be paid out. And so that's like a very sort of specific COVID related revenue hole that is pretty boring, but necessary.
Right. That's a good example. And I'm going to hedge everything with like, I assume that would qualify. And that's why particularly Katie and her role, and RPCs can answer these kinds of questions too. I'll get into how we're structured to do work on this in a minute, but those are those kinds of questions. Yeah, towns will just want to reach out to the folk who know the details about the rules and how the towns can, and just check before they make that commitment. But to me, it would seem like a logical. That's a really good example. And then the last one, of course, is to make the necessary investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. And so again, towns can also, through ARPA, they can band together to develop projects. And like for us, for broadband infrastructure, they wouldn't have to necessarily, but for a number of our communities are members of the new communications union district. I think it's DV Fiber is the more common name for it now. They may be requesting towns to contribute to their funding, but the other piece of the challenge of all this is the CUDs are also on their own getting a lot of just funding that's going to be coming through the state specific for those purposes. And so towns are going to be courted by a number of groups that are going to provide these services. But there's also, like I say, funding coming down from the state, and then there may be additional funding. I'm pretty sure the federal infrastructure bill, if it passes, I think there's additional money in there for rural broadband.
So much for rural broadband, yes.
And so that's where towns are going to have to make the decision about what they want to do. And at some point, it may feel a bit like pushing a string. There's going to be so much funding out there. How fast can groups even use it? Mm-hmm. And there's it is kind of one of those hurry up and wait type situations where there's a lot of energy and enthusiasm and pressure at one level for towns to make decisions. But on the other hand, everybody still kind of needs to pause a bit just to figure out how all these pieces can come together so that the most can be made out of the situation. And I've talked a lot. I will stop and let y'all ask questions, but then at some point I'll tell you about how we're actually structuring ourselves to help towns on this.
Well, that's kind of what I'm curious about. I'm really curious about how communities are making decisions about how to spend these funds. Where you're seeing decision making taking place, what public participation is looking like for it, how you all are able to support some communities that don't have very many mechanisms for public participation to figure that out. That's really some of the really interesting parts for me. Olga, what about you?
Thank you, Emily. One reason I'm excited to be talking to you, Chris, is because we don't have county government in Vermont. The regional commissions in many ways are our biggest kind of eye in the sky. They're definitely not a county government, but you're the one who really sees the big picture, I feel, in so many ways. So I'm excited to hear what you're hearing and where you're seeing maybe needs from towns. I'm also really curious. I'm excited and I'm hopeful for this ARPA funds that we would be able to have regional projects or multi-town projects. I don't know if there are any in the works, but if there are, I would really like to hear about those too. But yeah, let's start with how you're structured to work on this.
So so the regional planning commissions were given 3-year funding, $30,000 for 3 years to work with towns on. The first part was actually how to organize themselves to get the funding in the first place. And so we spent a lot of time going back until I guess late spring through the summer, working with towns, directly with the towns to help them understand what they needed to do to apply to U.S. Treasury to get the funding. And then we've gradually moved into just establishing lines of communication with towns. We've respectfully asked it to, like, for a primary point of contact, so that we're not just blasting the towns with requests for information or sending out guidance to everybody, every clerk, every select board member, every planning commission member. Because one of the things we learned during Irene was you never know who in a town is handling this work for them. So our initial communication chain was very broad, so that we were making sure that we weren't missing the town. And then similar, what we learned with the Communications Union District, what we did was we were asking for a primary point of contact that we can reliably reach out to and know that they'll get the information to the town. In a lot of cases, that may be a town administrator, a select board administrator, town manager, assistant town manager. But in a lot of other cases, it can be a volunteer that the select board has. It's frequently like a volunteer. A select board member will stand up and volunteer to do that work. And then what we're going to be, we have two staff people who are working on this, Sue Westa and Margot Gia. They're our leads, and it takes, we have a staff of only 10 people, but it's really taken 2 people to help do this work. And so they are constantly getting up to speed in communication with towns. Right now, a lot of the questions we're fielding are those questions of what should we be doing to solicit ideas from the public? Or should we be soliciting ideas from the public? Or how do we organize ourselves? Or a town may ask, can we, meaning the town, hire somebody to help lead this process for us? And the answer is yes, they can. And then sometimes we're already looking way down the road to, like, oh my gosh, we don't have the capacity to manage these projects, especially some of the towns that were disastered in July, because now they're dealing with FEMA. They're like, oh my gosh, we've already got these other grants that we're trying to manage. Now we've got FEMA coming into town. We've got to manage those projects. How are we going to manage those? So right now we're fielding those larger questions, and they tend to be pretty general. But then what we're going to be doing is, once the final guidance is out, we're going to be having a webinar for all towns about what the final guidance is and try to translate it into municipal English, so that everybody understands what the final guidance and rules are. That guidance can come anytime. The deadline is the end of the year. I'm not expecting it to probably show up before December. Just a hunch. I don't have any inside information, but just knowing how the feds work, it'll probably be a while. And so we'll start with that, and then what we're going to do is offer to towns, if they need us to help facilitate a conversation within the community, we can offer to help do that. If they need us to help facilitate connections with other funding sources, we're happy to do that. We don't have the capacity, unfortunately, to do a deep dive in every single community, because it's just there are too many of them. But we are trying to hopefully we're hoping to hire another planner who does like municipal planning, municipal planning and zoning and regional planning and zoning, to take some of the pressure off the other staff so that we can create more space for that. The other thing too, and not to get, just because this is a legislative session, the funding that we got to go for 3 years, we're going to use it probably within in 9 months.
Yeah, 30,000 doesn't sound like a lot for all this work, to be honest.
Yeah, and I'll just say something brief. So regional planning commissions, this, not to bore people, and this is not a crying poor or anything, but most of our funding streams are very narrow in scope, and they're performance-based grants, and typically it typically comes from an appropriation through the legislature, often through another agency, and so the funding we get, it's not like we don't have any taxation authority. We have we assess member towns relatively small amounts of money. It's about 5% of our budget, But otherwise, all of our grants are performance-based grants, and usually they're very fixed in scope. So it's like road erosion inventories, or emergency management planning grant, or transportation planning initiative, and they all have these very narrow scopes. So unfortunately, we don't have the capacity to just say, okay, we're going to put everything else on pause, and we're going to put a lot of resources into people to go out and meet with all the towns and organize regional projects and intermunicipal projects. And so would love to do that, but we'd love to do that in all kinds of different areas. But we do a really good job, though, of leveraging everything that we've got and putting everything that we can into helping towns. And so some of this will be somewhat organic as in terms of our approach, based on what we hear the town's needs might be. We've already helped some, for instance, Newfane's reached out to us as they put out an RFP to actually hire somebody to help them guide their public process on this. Other towns may take that same approach. Most aren't quite at that point yet. The other thing that's happened as a result of our housing crisis is we and Windham Windsor Housing Trust were both getting a lot of calls about, oh my gosh, this housing issue. Nobody can buy. We can't. Employers can't hire anybody because they are having trouble hiring because people can't find housing in the area. We have older people who are trying to move to housing, and there are no other options. They can't downsize. We have beginning homeowners, young families who now they're priced out of the market and don't have access. And so I think the housing crisis that frankly for some decision makers in the region was an issue for other people is now an issue for everybody. And so they've and I'm not being critical, this is normal. I've seen this in other places. Suddenly everybody's kind of woken up to it. And so we had a lot of questions about how can ARPA help with that. And so we're actually going to be doing a series of 3. If you go to our website, windhamregional.org, you'll see it. We're going to do a 3-part webinar series on housing. And we're going to try to get down to the brass tacks of just very basic, what does it take to develop housing in your town? And so the first session is going to be that kind of general, this is what has to happen. And there's a sequence, and I don't want to be a spoiler, but one of the things we're going to say is infrastructure. You can't develop housing without infrastructure.
You said that before, Chris.
I know. Yeah,
can we pause on that for a minute? Because I think it feels so profoundly unsexy right off the bat to people. And I think I want to just spend a moment on it for people to understand outside of our hub towns, what the wastewater capacity looks like. So that people can really understand what that means for housing in a community.
If we can do just...
I can wait until after the break.
Yeah, I think actually we do need to wait till after the break.
Great.
So hold that thought, but thank you for bringing that up, Emily, because that's important. The Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, shall return after a word from our underwriter, so stay tuned. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're just joining us, I'm your host, Olga Peters, and I'm speaking with regular contributor Emily Kornheiser and guest Chris Campany, who's the executive director of the Windham Regional Commission. You can also find the Montpelier Happy Hour anywhere you find podcasts, and Brattleboro Community Television, as well as our website, the montpelierhappyhour.captivate.fm, and Emily's social media channels as well. Hey, Emily, what do we need to remind listeners of?
In addition to the fact that there are few too many technology platforms for your communication needs floating around right now, we want to remind listeners that the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests, and not any of those platforms or stations that we are speaking on or through or around, nor any of our employers, partners, families, associations. It's just the views and opinions of these 3 separate people using their 3 separate mouths and brains. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow.
Hey, Chris, talk to us about...
I do it different each time, Chris, just right off the cuff there.
And she's welcome to do it because I get cranky about it. So Chris, talk to us about infrastructure. And as Emily said before the break, it's not very sexy, wastewater or sewer or water infrastructure, but we do need infrastructure if we're going to have housing. So I would love it if you could just outline for people why infrastructure is the new sexy.
So, and that's actually why I'm in Burlington right now. I created a panel. That sounds very powerful, very, I don't know, very powerful. But anyway, organized a panel for the Northern New England chapter of the American Planning Association to discuss this very issue. It was titled "The Fallacy of Compact Settlement in the Absence of Infrastructure."
Ooh.
And
very nice.
It's basically my cry in the wilderness. What we're discussing is, so this is the short answer to your question is, generally speaking, we're not going to develop housing in any meaningful way until we invest in, especially in rural areas, until we invest in the infrastructure to actually support it. And what that means is the pipe, the water, drinking water to get into homes and businesses and organizations, and a place to flush, to dispose of that water once you've used it. And the reason for that is, like even our communities that already have existing water and wastewater systems, those systems have limited capacity. And if you live in like Rockingham or Brattleboro or Wilmington or Dover, there are frequent updates to these kind of larger centralized systems. But in a lot of our villages, there is no community water or wastewater at all. And that basically means that each home or each business has its own individual septic and well. And the systems that we're talking about are probably soil-based systems, not the conventional systems like Brattleboro and Bellows Falls and others have. But these would be systems that would be more, they'd probably have like individual septic at some properties and collect gray water for some kind, and common distribution, or within a single village, you might have a few different clusters even of homes and businesses on different systems, but they'll be managed as one. But the reason for this is that for reasons of public health and safety, there are certain acreage requirements and soil requirements that are supposed to separate septic systems from wells. And in most of our villages, the lots are so small that so a lot of the lots. I used to live in Newfane Village. A lot of the lots are half acre, quarter acre, or smaller. And already, if you were to draw a circle based on your regulatory requirements, a lot of septic systems already shadow wells. And that doesn't mean necessarily that people's septage is getting into people's wells. But what you want to do though is have separation from where those leach fields are, where the gray water is being treated by through anaerobic means and saturating into the ground. You want to keep that away from where wellhead sources are. And then if you think about a lot of our villages, you're oftentimes constrained on one side by a stream and the other side by a road. And so many of our villages are only one house or 1 yard deep too, right? So it's not like you've got necessarily, blocks, village blocks in a lot of cases. So the reason why
I just want to make this concrete for people for just a moment. One thing that really brought this home for me for whatever reason is learning that the library in Weston doesn't have a bathroom. And that's just a tiny example, but when I think about Weston, it's definitely one of our wealthier villages in sort of the grand context of Vermont villages. And yet their library, which is a lovely library, is on a plot of land that doesn't have the capacity to have exactly what you described, right? A well and a septic system in the same place. And so they are in the situation where really basic amenities that most people think about are not possible because of the limits of just placing one system on one plot of property.
That's why so many of our village markets don't have the porta potty outside. It's not that they don't want you to use their toilet; they don't have the capacity for it, and probably the regulators wouldn't let them. And so, there's nothing like sitting in a porta potty in February in Vermont, but it definitely speeds you up. You don't spend a lot of time on your phone in there, but
I remember going into one once and it was like covered, there was no roof on it. And so like the entire inside was covered with snow. Yeah.
It's probably the most hygienic one you've ever been in.
Yeah.
But that's the issue. And that's why also it's like some markets, even if they wanted to have tables for people to sit and eat and drink at, and if they wanted to use actual plates as opposed to, you may wonder why you go to a restaurant in Vermont and you're getting paper plates and plastic cups. They don't have the dishwashing capacity. Mm-hmm. And so this wastewater issue not only gets to developing new housing and developing new businesses, but frankly, retaining the businesses and even homes that we've already got. And so I'll use my own story. In the village of Newfane, we applied for an in-law apartment, and we had a septic and well. Long story short, we ultimately got the approval, but we basically in our property records had to say, if we have the in-law apartment, we're basically calling our house a 2-bedroom, 1-bath home instead of 3-bedroom. I'm sorry, 3-bed. Our home was 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. But to get the in-law apartment, we're gonna have to say we were a 2-bedroom, 2-bath home. So in essence, we weren't increasing the number of dwelling units. And this is an issue and I know it sounds kind of technical, but it's kind of my aha moment in the village of like, if you look at a lot of villages, because of the small lot sizes and existence of existing septic systems and wells, in many of our villages, you probably couldn't add a single dwelling unit. Whether you're talking an in-law apartment, accessory dwelling unit. So no matter how much zoning we do, if the answer is not none, it's probably very, very few, because of the wastewater capacity issues. So where we're going with all this is we're stuck. The policy directives at the state level, and I'm going to go back to the conference here. I bring this issue up a lot because in other parts of the country where I've worked, whether in the South, and even in like New York and Maryland and other places, oftentimes the development of infrastructure is easy. That kind of planning and development they get. And so water and sewer, let's run it, guys, and we'll do the land use planning later. In New England, this is not just Vermont, but Vermont included, we do a lot of the land use planning, but we don't seem to be able to do the infrastructure piece. And so the Vermont's primary land use planning goal is to have compact settlements surrounded by rural countryside. And the problem with that is you can't do it because we don't have the infrastructure in place to actually achieve the compact settlements, except for our existing downtowns. So the larger communities can continue to grow, but that means our other communities basically are stuck. And so if like Windham Windsor Housing Trust, one of the first questions they're going to ask when they're asked by a town to come in and do a project is they're going to have to say, do you have water and sewer? And the answer is likely to be no. And so that's because they can't, you don't have the space to do so, an independent system on that small lot, like converting an inn into affordable housing. And so we've got all kinds of opportunities in our villages to do this kind of thing and to grow them even in a very, in a great way, but we don't have the infrastructure to support it. And so I talk about this so much in the state, it's almost, I think it's become a drinking game. It's like anytime it's when is Campany going to bring up the infrastructure piece, because it's so frustrating.
It is the Montpelier Happy Hour. And so I don't know if you've ever actually played a drinking game.
Do you have at least your tea or
glad
coffee?
That we're ready here.
I have my water right here. But that was, but the interesting thing was, in this session that we did, there were about 40 participants in the room. These are planners from this primarily Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, but also there's some interlopers, welcome interlopers from Massachusetts and other places. But when I asked the room, so the point of the panel was there are some of us working in Vermont to kind of set the stage of like, here are the policy directives that talk about compact settlement, which is awesome. It's one of the reasons I love working here. Is this recognition of the importance of smart growth and trying to prevent rural sprawl, because that has all kinds of problems related to public service provision and water quality and climate resilience and climate adaptation and greenhouse gas reduction, all these things that we say that we want. But the path of least resistance right now is large lot development and existing parcels on class 3 town roads. That's generally where you can build. And so we set that stage. And so I asked the question, the goal of the panel was to say, let's not have a complaint session, but who's had successes. Let's talk to each other about, like, well, what can we learn from each other about the approach of your state, the approach of your regional commission, the approach of your municipality to figure this out. And not a single person in the room could raise their hand and offer a solution. We did one person who provided a solution of it was actually in Vernon. Apparently, somebody had developed a septic system on a lot that was subsequently subdivided away from their home, and so they had to figure out how to get the system all on their property. And so what they did was they put in an aerobic system, because an aerobic system can have a smaller footprint. But among all those other planners in the room, there were no examples. And so this is not just a Vermont problem. This is a New England problem.
And so, Chris, sorry, I just, when you say it's a New England problem, is it a problem of regulation? Is it a problem of just not having the skills or the people who can do it? Like, what string needs to be pulled to?
I'm still trying to figure that out. I think part of what it is budget. And I'm going to go back to Vermont's approach to the Clean Water Initiative as an example of this. So I think, the ultimate statement of policy values is budgets. It's where you put the money. That's the ultimate statement of value. And I think what part of the issue is there's some funding that'll come in through the feds, through different programs. And states want to really try to spread that out as much as they can. And so they start with financing, when really, so it's like financing, planning for systems, and financing the systems themselves. What municipalities need are grants, because we don't really have the populations always to support the development of the systems and the ongoing maintenance. And I suspect that's an issue. I can only surmise this. I hope somebody can do a dissertation on this, or a thesis, looking at all the states. But I think that's part of it. Then oftentimes, right, the states want that money to get reimbursed through some kind of revolving loan fund or something. So they get paid back for those little bits of federal money they get. And so my argument is, and this is one of the things I'm arguing for on the Climate Council too, is if you think about Vermont's Clean Water Initiative, now the state was pushed toward this because of lawsuits around water quality in Lake Champlain, but the state ultimately took an all-in approach, meaning all Vermonters are going to contribute to ensuring that the waters of the state are clean. And it's a very broad approach, right? Right down to the municipal roads general permits. That's why you see your road crews out working in ditches, laying in stone, and trying to keep sediment from getting into streams. And so there's this all-in approach. I think we have to do that on wastewater and water. Not saying tax people just for the fun of taxing people, but if this is our principal planning goal, and this planning goal of compact settlements surrounded by rural countryside, that's not only the mission for all planning commissions in the state. That applies to state agencies. That is in the state comprehensive energy plan. That is in the state Global Warming Solutions Act. It's in the 2040 Long Range Transportation Plan. It's everywhere. The principal policy directive, but you can't do it until we invest in the infrastructure. And that's where that just kind of breaks my heart, because we've got all the right policy language, but you can't actually do it. And it drives me a little nuts, because it's like, I can help towns plan the hell out of this stuff. Sorry. We can plan all of this, and we can work with them on their zoning so that they got the zoning right. But if you don't have the wastewater capacity to actually build the housing, to expand existing businesses, to create new business, and I would argue, importantly, beginning to move development out of river corridors and out of floodplains and making those places more resilient, because looking ahead to the storms that we're gonna have, not just looking at the past, but looking at what can happen in the future. In order to make our communities more resilient, we have to have this infrastructure in place, and we've got to figure this out. And And this is why with ARPA, going back to ARPA, towns can do a lot with this funding you're not going to build a system with any of this money. It is not enough, but you can sure go a long way. That's why we're waiting for the guidance, final guidance coming through the Treasury. You can still go a long way to do the planning for it. But the way we need to really start this conversation is, and this is where we can come back into as a regional commission, is too oftentimes the conversations are this wastewater and water issue is dealt with as an engineering problem, and it's a planning issue. What we need to do is actually work with communities, and this is something where this isn't ARPA specific, but I think this has to happen. Too often the conversation in communities around what wastewater start with, can we afford it? Or like, are there health issues we need to be aware of? Can we afford it? What we need to do is sit down with towns and say, what is the role of the village in your community? Or what is the role of the downtown? How do you want to use it? What do you want to see there? Do you want to retain the homes and businesses? And so, and beyond, it's not planning jargon. It's like, would you like to be able to sit down and eat food in your village? Would you like to be able to have an inn in your village? Would you like to have more housing in your village? How much housing would you like to have? Would you like to one day be able to see the shuttered inn turn into affordable housing? Would you like to see capacity for more business offices there? Everybody wants a microbrewery, and that's a big wastewater user, no matter where you go. Everybody wants
on all ends.
Everybody wants the microbrewery in the village, and
a coffee shop.
Yep. And then there are a lot of people who just like to be able to use the bathroom at their village. And I'm not joking. One of the requests I've got a lot of is, do you think we can use this ARPA funding to put a public restroom in our village someplace, so that if a bus comes through, or if I'm in town doing business and I don't want to freeze to death, we do have an aging population, and I would count myself among those. It'd be nice to have a facility where you're not freezing to death if you need to do something. So, but we need to do that kind of planning work up front, because that then tells you. And then we also need to type the conversation about how do we, if we grow the village, if we expand on the margins, how do we do so in a way that we move ourselves away from the stream and the river and become more flood resilient? And so we got to have those conversations, and that informs the engineering questions.
And so, Chris, I'm going to fully interrupt you now. I want to know, what I hear you saying is that the conversation about how to use the funds for wastewater systems needs to start with, what do people actually want their communities to look like? And that's a conversation, that we've talked on the happy hour a whole bunch of times about how town meeting in its very structure is not sort of generative enough to be able to have those conversations. We know that the Council on Rural Development occasionally selects towns to be having these conversations, and then there's no funding attached to that conversation. And so are you seeing opportunities from these ARPA funds for people in communities to get sort of sparked enough to really be sitting down and saying, oh, wow, this is an opportunity, maybe not to fully implement something, but to create transformational change in how we operate as a village or as a town? And how are people starting to have those conversations? Do people in the communities have the resources to have those conversations? What else needs to happen for those conversations to be supported?
So I think the answer to all that is a lot of them want to have that conversation. A lot of them don't know how to necessarily do it. And that's where we want to help. I think from my perspective, this needs to happen just as frankly as general public meetings and public discussions. They need to be inclusive. And I know even if you've got a small community, again, I'll go back to where I used to live in Newfane. You probably need to have a couple of these. You need to have one in Newfane Village. You need to have one in Williamsville or South Newfane, because it's a small town, but you may as well live in different worlds. And I think the people in Newfane would say, yes, he's right. I don't think that's not a snarky comment at all. I mean, I think Westminster, you've got a mountain that divides it, or ridge, and so you've got many different areas of Westminster. So I would encourage, like Westminster, to have one in northeast, southeast, northwest, southwest. It's a pretty big town, and Rockingham, incredibly diverse town in terms of, the pockets of where the different places, areas that have their own identities. So those are just a few examples, but there really does need to be this kind of robust engagement. And I would encourage folks to not get so tied up necessarily in just how the ARPA funding can be used. Is have the larger vision conversation about what your community needs are, and then figure out how ARPA might fit it. And there absolutely is an opportunity for major infrastructure investment. That may not be the panacea for everything, but I mean, I do hope some communities will use this as an opportunity to kind of do that kind of transformational change to support the things that they want to do. It's not water's sake, it's to do all of these other things that they want to do. I also hope it's an opportunity for towns to talk to each other. So like even on the housing issue, as communities begin to talk internally about like, what are our housing needs? What do we see? It may be that the housing may not make sense in your own town. It may make better sense to be in another adjoining town that maybe just has better capacity because of soils, topography, other things like that, to locate the wastewater system and thus the concentrated housing someplace else. So an example would be like Londonderry I don't know the details of their wastewater study, but North Londonderry is really challenging because of the proximity of the West River, and basically the village is kind of is up against ledge, and you got a lot of brownfields in there. South Londonderry is similar, but is the solution perhaps collaborating with Weston or Winhall to really kind of come up with that area's housing needs as opposed to just that individual's town's housing needs? And so we're going to do everything we can to help support those conversations. In some cases, it may make sense for towns to either individually or collectively to use some of the ARPA funding to hire a consultant. We may, if you want to do a deeper dive than what we can provide, and we'll help you. We're happy to help towns every way we can. We're also happy to to help towns figure out how to get the resources that they need. And the ARPA funding can be used to hire consultants or even staff to help work this through.
So Chris, I'm jumping in because we have just under 5 minutes in this section. So I just wanted to check in with you and Emily to see anything you want to kind of tie up or make sure you leave listeners with before we sign off today.
Oh, Emily, go first.
No, it's that idea of sort of starting with the planning that I'm really curious about. And I feel like we've really covered that transformational change doesn't happen overnight, but we have an opportunity here from both what we've all experienced over the last 2 years of upheaval and the questions that's allowed us to ask as communities, and the fact that there is the infusion of dollars more than even paying for things just makes possibility feel possible. And so really want to make sure that as we're moving forward, we're supporting communities to be having the conversations they need to have, to be leveraging the planning resources that they need to use to figure out ways to be looking, 10, 20, 50 years out about what we want our communities to be. Because this is a once in many generations opportunity in the midst of all this upheaval.
Mm-hmm. Chris.
I guess it says this is the legislative happy hour. Is that right?
Yeah.
Montpelier Happy Hour. So I guess even better, more gooder. What I would say is I am really afraid that we're about to go down the same damn path we keep going down.
Me too.
Because I'm afraid that at the state level, they're not engaging with the people who are on the ground actually implementing these things. And I'm afraid that the proposals that are going to come out of the state, I love these people to death. Vermont's a small state. We all work with each other. We all know each other. We all like each other. But I'm really concerned that at the agency level, that they're not reaching out to the RPCs, to municipalities, the LCT, to say, hey, is what we're proposing to use the ARPA funds for makes sense? Are we proposing use of these funds in a way that you can actually use them, and in a way that they'll create transformational change, or is it more the model of what's not been working? And so I'm really nervous about that at the end of all this, we're going to be, towns will have spent their funding. They won't be able to necessarily make use of the funds, state funds. That there's still going to be this kind of Hunger Games approach to towns. Here's the RFP, go get it. And the towns who have capacity can, and those who don't won't. So I just hope that the state will be very deliberative and frankly, get out of their comfort zone a bit, get out of the bubble and engage with folk. This isn't about RPCs getting money or towns getting money or anything. It's literally the conversation about how do we make this work? How do we really leverage all of this funding together so that we really can make the transformational change that we need to have? And this is one of the things that worries me most about the climate council and the climate action plan that we're creating is we'll see a lot of good ideas, but I'm also scratching my head about how on earth they're going to get implemented if we keep going down the same way.
Let's talk about that soon, because that's a whole other fantastic conversation. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Chris Campany from the Windham Regional Commission for joining us today. I think what's really sticking with me right now is what you said about starting with the planning and then thinking about how it fits with the money or how the money fits with it even better. And the reason that is sticking with me is for a few reasons, but one is we just came out of a pandemic. We're still kind of in it, but we've come out in 2020 of a really crisis year. And now we're kind of managing that crisis, but we've been so reactive in so many ways that I think we really, with this money, need to slow down and think beyond the reaction and think, as Emily said, many generations. And so I hope towns and communities can do that and see the horizon again and instead of just the immediate emergency that many of us live in many ways, even beyond the pandemic.
And I'll go just real quick to your point on the housing front. We're talking for the region, Brattleboro alone, we're probably talking 1,000 new units. Throughout the region, we're talking many hundreds, not a few accessory dwelling units. And that's another piece of this conversation that we need to have as a region about what those needs are just to meet current needs for people who are already here, not people who are not even who are born, so anyway, we need to your point, we need to start also thinking differently than we have.
Yeah. And on that note, thank you for joining us with the Montpelier Happy Hour. I love that, Chris. Thank you for ending us there. We will be back next week with Carolyn and Katie Buckley to talk about ARPA at kind of the state level and what the VLCT is doing with municipalities. So be sure to join us next week. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.